I'm going to talk to you a bit about static variables before I explain Lab41, which is the markup function with the static variable and default argument. Okay, so a static variable is a variable that's contents remain in memory from function call to function call. Let's back up a little bit. When we create variables inside of functions, local variables inside of functions, remember those variables are created at the time the function is called, and then when the function terminates, those variables are no longer in memory. So every time the function calls, we get new variables created in memory, and therefore the values in those variables are not kept from function call to function call. So let's talk about how a static variable works. A static variable is created inside a function, and it's still a local variable, but it gets initialized the very first time the function is called, and then when the function terminates, that static variable remains in memory. It does not get removed from memory when the function terminates. So if the function is called again, that variable does not get reinitialized. Whatever the contents were after that function terminated, well, that static variable's value is still in memory. So we're going to make use of that in our Lab41 today. And let's get started. It says, included in your programming window is a modified program from the author's Chapter 6, Video 3. There are 3 sets of wholesale and markup data that is read in, and then calculate retail is being called 3 times, passing the values that are read in. All right, so one additional wholesale value is read in to test the default parameter for markup. This is very important. I even bolded it. Do not change the main function in any way. So in order to understand how static variables work, make sure that you follow these instructions. And I will be grading this manually to make sure you follow these instructions. Your main function should not be any different than the one that you have been given. All right, we're supposed to declare a static variable, highest markup to date, inside the function calculate retail. Well, remember, we're not changing the main function, so all of your changes are going to be inside calculate retail. So we need to declare a variable, and I tell you to call it highest markup to date, and we're going to make it an int. And then it says to initialize your highest markup to date variable with markup. Well, markup is a parameter, so the value that's passed into your markup parameter needs to be the value you initialize highest markup to date with. Now remember that initialization only happens the very first time the function is called. So at every other function call, you will not change the highest markup to date value. Okay, it says every time the function is called, we should compare highest markup to date to markup, and if markup is higher, then replace highest markup to date with markup. We're going to be comparing highest markup to date to markup. And if we find a higher value in markup, then we need to replace highest markup to date with markup. So basically, every time we find something larger in markup than what we've already stored, we're going to replace highest markup to date with that value. So highest markup to date is going to be keeping up with the highest markup that we have found. So inside the calculate retail function, output the value of wholesale markup and highest markup to date as specified below. Before we look at the Figure 1 and Figure 2 sample input and output data, let's go down and look at the program. All right, we have a main function that you should not change. I've given you a prototype for your calculate retail function. You don't have to write that. Here's your calculate retail function. You do have to add some code to the body of this function. Now up here we see something that we haven't used before. Notice that we have a default parameter here. What this is used for is when calculate retail is called and this parameter is not passed an argument, then it will automatically be initialized to 25. So there will be a point in our code where we don't pass in a markup So this is the second parameter that's defined. So there will be a time where we call our calculate retail without an argument for markup, and in that scenario it will be automatically initialized to the 25. Okay, let's look at our main function and see what's happening. We have two variables, both of type double, wholesale and markup, that are initialized to 0. We set our precision to 2 and fixed so that we can output 2 significant digits after the decimal point. And then we read into wholesale and markup. So if you look at the data that we're reading in, that would be reading 10 into wholesale and 30 into markup. Okay, so we then output the retail price is, and before we actually output that, we call calculate retail, passing in wholesale and markup. So before this is ever output, this function call happens. So we're going to be calling calculate retail, passing in wholesale and markup. Remember, I told you that this is the 10 and this is the 30. We had a $10 wholesale amount and a 30% markup. So wholesale will be passed into wholesale. Markup will be passed into markup. Now, inside this function, we need to calculate the retail price. But before we can do that, we need to follow these instructions that says, declare a static integer variable called highest markup to date and initialize it with the markup parameter. This is the markup parameter. We need to define a variable of type static int. So we use the static keyword and then the int data type. That's the format of a static variable. So this static variable needs to be called highest markup to date, and it needs to be initialized with markup. This markup is initialized with this parameter, and this parameter had this value passed into it. Now they're the same name. They could be different names. Remember, I said that a static variable only gets initialized the first time the function is called. So here are subsequent function calls. In these subsequent function calls, this declaration and initialization does not happen. It only happens the first time. Now the next comment says, if a higher markup value is found, replace the contents of highest markup to date with value. This is an if statement. How do you know if a higher markup amount is found? Well, I'm going to let you figure that out. You have to write a conditional expression in here that determines this. If a higher markup is found, well, the markup is here. So this is where you're finding the markup. If there's a higher value in markup than there is in highest markup to date, then replace highest markup to date with that value. So in other words, highest markup to date will equal markup. All right, then we calculate the retail. This retail is a local variable defined in our calculate retail function. And it needs to be your wholesale times your markup divided by 100 plus your wholesale. So this is the actual retail amount. Now, you need to write two output statements. You output the wholesale and the markup and the highest markup to date. That is corresponding to these two lines of output in your sample output. So the markup on that $10 is your wholesale amount, your wholesale parameter. That 30% is your markup. And then the highest markup to date, this 30% is your highest markup to date variable. Where does this output come from? The retail price is, remember, that is output in your main function. The retail price is $. So whatever your calculate retail returns, notice there's a return statement down here, that is what is going to be output here. So this is the last line of output in each of these sample output. Here we read in two more values. So if you go back up to the sample input, we read in 1250 and 28 into our wholesale and markup respectively. Then before this is ever output, we call our calculate retail, passing in those values. So once again, we're going to be calculating the retail. Remember, wholesale here is passed into wholesale. Markup is passed into markup. This does not run on the second call of calculate retail because remember I said the initialization of a static variable only happens the first time it's called. So here when we're comparing inside this if statement highest markup to date to markup, well, this highest markup to date will be the previous value that we set it to in the previous function call. So we'll compare highest markup to markup, and if we find a larger value in markup, then we need to replace highest markup to date with markup. Then we calculate our retail, then we output the wholesale, the markup, and the highest markup to date, and then we return our retail value. That will be output in the output statement that says the retail price is $. Okay, the last CN, notice that it only reads in a single value. There is no markup read in. And then when we call calculate retail, we only pass in wholesale. So this wholesale gets passed into this wholesale. But what gets passed into markup? Nothing. But remember up here in our prototype, we had a default parameter. So this 25 gets passed into markup. And so in this calculate retail function, markup will be initialized. The parameter markup will be initialized to 25. So we'll have wholesale passed into wholesale and 25 passed into markup. Okay, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me.